Well, hello, hello. So we're gonna try to get through this one before any of the little ones wake up. It is kind of a longer one. This is Leviticus 13. Now, I've said before that a lot of the laws in Levitical laws, I should say, are all about keeping you healthy, basically. And you'll really see this here, that the priests were the physicians as well. And we'll get into biblical quarantines. So, just getting out right off the bat, this is about skin diseases and monitoring them. Again, not the most exciting parts of the Bible, but interesting nonetheless. So, regulations about defiling skin diseases. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When anyone has a swelling or a rash or a shiny spot on their skin that may be a defiling skin disease, they must be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons who is a priest. The priest is to examine the sore of the skin, and if the hair in the sore has turned white and the sore appears to be more than skin deep, it is a defiling skin disease. When the priest examines that person, he shall pronounce them ceremonially unclean. If the shiny spot on the skin is white but does not appear to be more than skin deep, and the hair is not turned white, the priest is to isolate the affected person for 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest is to examine them, and if he sees that the sore is unchanged and does not spread in the skin, he is to isolate them for another 7 days. On the seventh day, the priest is to examine them again, and if the sore has faded and has not spread in the skin, the priest shall pronounce them clean. It is only a rash. They must wash their clothes, and they will be clean. But if the rash does spread in their skin after they have shown themselves to the priest to be pronounced clean, they must appear before the priest again. The priest is to examine that person, and if the rash has spread in the skin, he shall pronounce them unclean. It is a defiling skin disease. When anyone has a defiling skin disease, they must be brought to the priest. The priest is to examine them, and if there is a white swelling in the skin that has turned the hair white, and if there is a raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic skin disease, and the priest shall pronounce them unclean. He is not to isolate them because they are already unclean. If the disease breaks out all over their skin, and so far as the priest can see, it covers all the skin of the affected person from head to foot, the priest is to examine them, and if the disease has covered their whole body, he shall pronounce them clean. Since it has all turned white, they are clean. But whenever raw flesh appears on them, they will be unclean. When the priest sees the raw flesh, he shall pronounce them unclean. The raw flesh is unclean. They have a defiling disease. If the raw flesh changes and turns white, they must go to the priest. The priest is to examine them, and if the sores have turned white, the priest shall pronounce the affected person clean. Then they will be clean. I really wonder, I'm sure somebody has to have. I mean, the number of Jewish doctors there are throughout history. But if you would get a doctor who really knows his stuff, a research medical doctor, and look at these rules and how they line up with actually determining somebody who has some sort of skin disease. And the skin disease is another word for leprosy. Other interpretations will just say leprosy. It's kind of an all-encompassing definition of skin diseases. This translation just says skin disease. But anyway, I really wonder what it would look like if a research medical doctor looked into, skin turning white. What are the reasons for skin turning white? What are the reasons for the hair turning white? What good is that at predicting a disease is a problem? Now, we already know things like, is it superficial or is it, the epidermis? If it's deeper tissue, then it's more of a problem. I mean, that's stuff we already know today. So I do wonder about that. And you notice there's the quarantine, the 7 days. One thing that I really noticed when I was doing my research for this video was how leprosy is a representation of sin, and here I can find all the listings for it on this one probably. Here, leprosy is like sin in many ways. It was a representation of sin, much like yeast in the bread, that sort of thing. There are some good reasons why many ancient rabbis considered a leper as someone already dead. Leprosy is like sin in that. I'll get to my point on this, but it begins as nothing. It is painless in its first stages. It grows slowly. It often remits for a while, then returns. It numbs the senses. One cannot feel in the afflicted area. It causes decay and deformity. It eventually gives a person a repulsive appearance. That's incredible, in my opinion. I mean, how many of us can relate? Like, most sin, outside of things like murder or rape or anything, but most sin starts small. It's nothing. Think about, a lot of people in today's day and age were exposed to porn at a young age. You first, just a naked woman, just a magazine and a naked woman, and then it's painless, it's nothing, but you keep going back to it, and it spreads and it spreads and it spreads. That's the way sin was. See, when Jesus came around, by the time he got there, lepers were like, and it wasn't even so much that it was a contagion. It was the way that, as it says here, the rabbis considered a leper as someone already dead. Leprosy is like sin. They made the... my dog stepped on one of the toys. It's gonna laugh again. So when Jesus came around, he was like, oh no, the lepers you have to stay away from, not only for disease purposes, but also because they represented sin. And so it makes that story of Jesus healing the leopard and accepting the leopard even more remarkable, because leprosy represented sin. He's accepting the sinners. He's accepting those who are willing to come back to him, and he's healing them of their sin, healing them of their leprosy. The priest class and the rabbis had made it almost so that, the people with leprosy were the problem, when in reality leprosy just represented sin. It wasn't that leopard is sin themselves, or that they even have committed sin or anything like that. It's just a representation, just like yeast. There's nothing wrong with yeast, okay? They were allowed to eat bread with yeast at times. It just was a representation of sin. And you can see how that over time, they forget that it's representation. They started to just understand the lepers as being sin almost. They put sin on leopards. And of course, Christ, he welcomes them in, he heals them. It's a cool representation. Anyway, move on. This is a long one, so I don't want to spend too much time on any one thing. I'm sure that somebody has, and if you guys ever have the time, and I probably will if I ever have the time, I'd like to find like a research paper written on the science behind a lot of these rules and how they would actually apply. When someone has a boil on the skin and it heals, and in the place where the boil was, the white swelling or reddish white spot appears, they must present themselves to the priest. Like, is that something that doctors still look for? Like, if you have a mole and they say if it gets bigger or changes or whatever, then you gotta look out for it. I wonder if these are things they still look out for. The priest is to examine it, and if it appears to be more than skin deep, and the hair in it has turned white, the priest shall pronounce... I want the white hair, what does that mean? Shall pronounce that person unclean. It is a defiling skin disease that has broken out where the boil was. But when the person examines it, there is no white hair in it, and it is not more than skin deep and has faded, then the priest is to isolate them for 7 days. If it is spreading in the skin, the priest shall pronounce them unclean. It is a defiling disease, leprosy. But if the spot is unchanged and has not spread, it is only a scar from boil, and the priest shall pronounce them clean. When someone has a burn... Oh, also notice earlier, I forgot to mention this. If the person is already determined to be unclean, it says they don't need to isolate them because they're already unclean. And when they are isolated, it's like only for 7 days. I mean, we're gonna keep reading through all the way through the Bible, but I'm starting to wonder, like, why were there leprosy communities where they were completely isolated indefinitely when Christ came around? Because it says earlier, you isolate for 7 days, re-examine if you need to, isolate another 7, re-examine them, and it even says if they are determined at that point to be completely unclean, it literally says there's no need to isolate them. I'll read it again. Yeah, you don't need to isolate them because here. This is verse 11. It is a chronic skin disease, and the priest shall pronounce them unclean. He is not to isolate them because they are already unclean. So it's like, once you've been determined to be unclean, there's no more need for the isolation. They've already, okay, yeah, you got it. I think the isolation is more so to make sure that you weren't being exposed to anything. Supports Big Bear's terrain theory, I guess. But it was to make sure they weren't getting exposed to anything, if that exposure was causing it, whatever, I guess. And also to represent sin. So at Christ's time, there was like these whole communities where lepers just lived in isolation. I wonder when or how that got started. Maybe we'll find it. Maybe we'll find out as we keep reading. But it doesn't seem like that's the way it's supposed to be. When someone has When someone has a burn on their skin and a reddish white or white spot appears in the raw flesh of the burn, the priest is to examine the spot, and if the hair in it has turned white and it appears to be more than skin deep, it is a defiling disease that has broken out in the burn. The priest shall pronounce them unclean. It is a defiling skin disease, but if the priest examines it and there is no white hair in the spot, and if it is not more than skin deep and has faded, then the priest is to isolate them for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine that person. If it is spreading in the skin, the priest shall pronounce them unclean. It is a defiling skin disease. If, however, the spot is unchanged and has not spread in the skin but has faded, it is swelling from the burn, and the priest shall pronounce them clean. It is only a scar from the burn. If a man or a woman has a sore on their head or chin, the priest is to examine the sore, and if it appears to be more than skin deep, and the hair in it is yellow and thin, the priest shall pronounce them unclean. It is a defiling skin disease on the head or chin. But if, when the priest examines the sore, it does not seem to be more than skin deep, and there is no black hair in it, then the priest is to isolate the affected person for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine the sore, and if it has not spread, and there is no yellow hair in it, and it does not appear to be more than skin deep, then the man or woman must shave themselves, except for the affected area, and the priest is to keep them isolated another 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine the sore, and if it has not spread in the skin, and appears to be no more than skin deep, the priest shall pronounce them clean. They must wash their clothes, and they will be clean. But if the sore does spread in the skin after they are pronounced clean, the priest is to examine them, and if he finds that the sore has spread in the skin, he does not need to look for yellow hair. They are unclean. If, however, the sore is unchanged so far as the priest can see, and if black hair has grown in it, the affected person is healed. They are clean, and the priest shall pronounce them clean. When a man or woman has white spots on the skin, the priest is to examine them, and if the spots are dull white, it is a harmless rash and that has broken out on the skin. They are clean. A man who has lost his hair and is bald is clean. I don't know why that's funny. It's gonna be me one day. If he has lost his hair from the front of his scalp and has a bald forehead, he is clean. Yeah, that's gonna be me. But if he has a reddish white sore on his bald head or forehead, sunburn, it is a defiling disease breaking out on his head or forehead. The priest is to examine them. If the swollen sore on his head or forehead is reddish white, like a defiling skin disease, the man is diseased and is unclean. The priest shall pronounce them unclean because of the sore on his head. Anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of their face, and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." As long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside the... Okay, all right. There we go. Question answered. Well, that blows. So you have to live in an isolated camp outside. All right, that explains my question from earlier. So you have to walk around saying unclean, unclean. I gotta see what the commentary has to say on that. I'm sure it represents something somehow. One thing to always remember too is that don't put your generational values on another generation. Okay, God's values don't really change, but generational values do. It's a harder time. We could be like, oh, that's so shameful, that'd be so awful. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they didn't care as much about that sort of thing back then. Maybe they saw them, you don't know. I mean, who knows? I think it sounds crazy to have to walk around and say, I mean, think about everybody has cancer, skin cancer. Unclean, unclean, and tore clothes, But to them, that might have been their way of showing devotion to God, People do pray when they get skin disease. So don't put your generational values on God. That's kind of a pretty ridiculous thing to do that a lot of people do. All right, so about the torn clothes. Once diagnosed with leprosy, it was confirmed, everything changed for the leper. Yeah, we get that. The leprous person is required to be as one that mourned for the dead or for some great and public calamity. So it is kind of a way of worship, I guess, or mourning. The emphasis is not on complete separation from all others. Okay, so they have to dwell alone. Since people with this condition were permitted to live with each other, but they had to be away from the rest of the community. And you could get visitors, I'm sure. As strict as this was, eventually many of the Jewish people went further in excluding lepers from society. See, yeah, that's what I think. Here we go. In the days of Jesus, many Jews thought two things about a leper. You are the walking dead, and you deserve this because this is the punishment of God against you. Okay, see, that's what I think. I think it was more so like, okay, you guys have this disease. It's almost like a nursing home or an assisted living community. And over time, people just stop going and visiting them. Yeah, and that's kind of the way it works, It's and unfortunately, it's kind of the way it works with people like that. And then eventually you start looking at them like, So by the time of Jesus, 1,000 years later or whatever, from the time of these laws, let me get my dates right. Anyway, so I think that we can all kind of relate to that one. That at first they were just separated to an isolated community, but they were still allowed to have visitors, and they lived together, and they probably grew their own food. But in public, their way of worship almost, or showing reverence to God, would have been to wear the torn clothing and to yell unclean, as a reminder of people of sin in their lives and how it can corrupt, and one of the things we talked about. But over time, it became forgotten, and generations later, it's just like, oh, that's gross, unclean people. Don't go near them. Don't visit them. It's like, that's our cousin. No. So, see what else they have to say, because that's the thing that interests me. Jewish custom said that you should not even greet a leper, and you had to stay 6 feet, 2 meters away from them. One rabbi bragged that he would not even buy an egg on a street where he saw a leper. He bragged, okay? Do you understand why Big Bear can tease this culture so easily? They bragged about it. The whole point wasn't even that you weren't allowed to go near them. It was a representation more than anything, and to keep them and other people safe. But you could still go visit them. It's like bragging, people who brag that they didn't go visit their grandparents in the nursing home during COVID because they didn't want to. It's like, You're bragging about that? Ugh. And another boasted that he threw rocks at lepers to keep them from coming close. Some rabbis didn't even allow a leper to wash his feet. But Jesus was different. He loved lepers. He touched them and healed them when they had no hope at all. Because of modern drugs and treatments, leprosy is almost unknown in the Western world. At one time, there were 2 leper colonies in the United States, but they have been closed. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to read this part again. As strict as this was about the isolation, eventually many of the Jewish people went further in excluding lepers. In the days of Jesus, many Jews thought 2 things about lepers. You are the walking dead, and you deserve this because this is the punishment of God against you. Jewish custom said that you should not even greet a leper, and you had to stay 6 feet away from them. One rabbi bragged that he would not even buy an egg on a street where he saw a leper, and another boasted that he threw rocks at lepers to keep them from coming close. Some rabbis didn't even allow a leper to wash their feet. Okay. So you see what I'm saying? Isolated community, that they can live together. You're allowed to have visitors. You come into the community to do things, obviously, because there's lepers selling eggs on the street that they had to yell unclean when they walked around. So they're still able to interact, just you have to be living in isolation because you have this illness. Like we have today, nursing homes, assisted living centers, these things do exist. But it just reminds me of COVID, when people are like, oh, we can't go visit. We used to, a wife now, we were engaged at the time. Her mom was grandma was in hospice, and they had to have limited visitors. You're not supposed to come in. You gotta wear masks, all that stuff. Well, her sons, my wife's father and brothers, made it so that she had a room on the first floor, and it was sliding glass door, so we'd all just come in. Like, one person would go in, sign in, then we'd all just come in, and who cares, I don't know, that was a tangent. But yeah, by the time Jesus came around, they were bragging about throwing rocks to keep the lepers away, when in reality it's just supposed to be an assisted living center. Wow. All right, I'm sorry, that was a big time tangent. Regulations about defiling molds. As for any fabric, I think this part ties a lot into the not combining of fabrics. Now, I'm not saying you should wear combo fabrics. I probably am right now. I'm not really aware of it. I don't look at that sort of things. I'm not a fancy pants lollipops kind of guy. But, every day you should try and follow God even more. And if one of those things is, say, I want to be more to the law, then, maybe you don't mix fabrics. But I think this mold thing would be the reason at their time, in their generation, why it would have been important, probably. As for any fabric that is spoiled with a defiling mold, any woolen or linen clothing, any woven, or knitted material or of linen or wool, any leather or anything made of leather, if the affected area in the fabric, the leather, the woven or knitted material, or any leather article is greenish or reddish, it is a defiling mold and must be shown to the priest. The priest is to examine the affected area and isolate the article for 7 days. On the 7th day, he is to examine it, and if the mold has spread in the fabric, the woven or knitted material or the leather, whatever its use, it is a persistent defiling mold. The article is unclean. He must burn the fabric, the woven or knitted material of wool or linen, or any leather article that has been spoiled because the defiling mold is persistent. The article must be burned. And if, when the priest examines it, the mold has not spread in the fabric, the woven or knitted material, or the leather article, he shall order that the spoiled article be washed, and he is to isolate it for another 7 days. After the article has been washed, the priest is to examine it again. If the mold has not changed its appearance, even though it has not spread, it is unclean. But burn it, no matter which side of the fabric has been spoiled. If, when the priest examines it, the mold has faded after the article has been washed, He is to tear the spoiled part out of the fabric, the leather, or the woven or knitted material, but if it reappears in the fabric, in the woven or knitted material, or in the leather article, it is a spreading mold. Whatever has the mold must be burned. Any fabric, woven or knitted material, or any leather article that has been washed and is rid of the mold must be washed again, then it will be clean. These are the regulations concerning defiling molds in woolen or linen clothing, woven or knitted material, or any leather article, for pronouncing them clean or unclean. So that one's pretty straightforward. Look out for mold in your clothing. I mean, I don't really know. Let's see what the commentary says. If the mold or mildew or fungus has faded, hardly anything for the commentary. So, again, the Levitical laws, especially someone who's just come into their faith and they're excited or passionate, or as I was when I first really was discovering God, was when I was a child, this is not interesting stuff usually. Okay? Stuff you read over, you pass over, but there's still stuff to take from it, like leprosy, what it represents. And it helps you to understand the whole Bible. Because if you don't understand things, you can really get the wrong perspective. I mean, look at the way the Jews at the time of Jesus were treating the leopards. And you think, what kind of culture would treat these people like this? But if you understand that leprosy was meant to represent sin, and that they put that representation onto the people with leprosy, not the leprosy itself, and they started to abuse, and you can see why they acted that way. And then you can learn, well, how am I doing that in my life? How is society doing that with people today? Are we putting things on a group of people? Oh man, how often is that being done? How often was Owen Benjamin call them the deli Jews? How often are they blamed for stuff that people who call themselves Jews do? How often are right-wing Christians blamed for something that crazy right-wing Christians done? I think it's very common for us to take something that might be used representationally in the Bible, or that was used representationally for God to educate his people, and generations later they didn't realize what that representation meant, and they just put it directly on. Now, that isn't to mean that the Bible isn't literal. It is. They were literally supposed to examine the people with skin disease and literally supposed to isolate them if they had the disease. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't also have a deeper representational meaning. So on one hand, you're keeping the community and those people safe. Okay, you don't know what the cause of this disease necessarily was. It's a variety. It's a skin disease. Leprosy is kind of a very encompassing term in the Bible. It could have been exposure to somebody else, in the community. It could have been something in the community that was making them sick. We don't know what it was. Maybe they did have something that was contagious and could have spread to everyone else. Whatever it might have been. But God didn't want them to be without him in their lives. God didn't want them to have rocks thrown at them or anything. If anything, God probably wanted the community to continue to show passion for them. Just as his representation here on earth, Christ the Son, came here and loved the leopards and the sinners. I think that's what God expected of his people, was that these isolated individuals who have this disease that is a representation of sin, I want you, my people, who are supposed to be a blessing to the world, that's what the covenant was, to help to take care of these people. Not let your sons and generations later think that they need to throw rocks at them to keep them away. Anyway, Old Testament, Levitical laws, a lot of them, most of them, it's about keeping people healthy. But there is almost always, I won't say always, but almost always a deeper representational meaning. I'm sure there's a deeper one for the fabric one, but that one seems pretty common. We still look for mold in our clothes all the time. So everyone, I hope that if nothing else, this encourages you to dive deeper into your Bible. You really will have a deeper understanding of like a parable or something that you know from your youth or from your early days of the church, or of not necessarily church, but just of discovering your faith, a story about Jesus, or a story in the New Testament, or a famous, story about David or something, you will get a deeper understanding if you go back to these more boring chapters and understand everything about it. It's kind of like knowing the world book for Game of Thrones, and when you read the Game of Thrones books, if you know the history of the world, or knowing the Silmarillion before you read the Fellowship of the Rings and all that stuff. That's a fantasy nerd reference if anyone wants to know. Anyway, enough tangents. I need to get to taking care of my kids. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon, evening, or good night. God bless.